Hello, today is Thursday, June 3rd, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. With IT services, at some point, most companies go through a transition from one supplier to another. This can be a daunting effort and a process that has to be carefully managed. If you're gearing up for a supplier change, there are steps that you need to take to minimize disruption. Fortunately, on today's podcast, I'm joined by Ben Fox, one of TC2's managing directors, and Marc Lindsey, a senior partner at LB3. And Marc is also president of Avenue 4, which is a leading IPv4 advisory firm. Both Ben and Marc have helped many of our clients through this supplier change process, and they have some useful insights to share. Hey guys, thanks for joining me. So Ben, why don't you tee up today's topic?
Hi Joe, yeah, certainly. So I think the best way to introduce this topic is by noting that commodity technology products, so think, smartphone services, network circuits, conferencing services, those kind of commodity services and products can largely be transitioned from one supplier to another without much, if any, assistance from the outgoing provider. But what we found is that managed services and outsourced services are far, far harder to transition without any help from the outgoing provider. So, for instance, as an example, the customer may not have right access to its own equipment that the outgoing provider currently manages. So at a very minimum, you may need the outgoing provider to do some work to simply hand over that access to you or to the successor provider. And what we found is outsourcing contracts typically anticipate this, and they provide so-called transition assistance obligations on the outgoing vendor. Marc, why don't you elaborate a little on that?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. The transition to a new vendor, as Ben describes, oftentimes takes considerable coordination between the incumbent, the successor, and the client. This sort of delicate handoff happens right when the breakup with the incumbent is at its worst. So the incumbent at that time has very little motivation to cooperate, provide top quality support, or generally help its replacement succeed. In this context, we negotiate several key terms in the base agreement to help facilitate that transition. In those key terms, we like to focus on some fundamental principles. For example, the transition assistance should be available regardless of the reason the term is ending, including termination by the provider for cause. The transition assistance should be available in partial termination scenarios. Sometimes those clauses only speak to full terminations, but we found that partial terminations, there's an equal need for coordinated transition and handoff. To provide you with the necessary flexibility, the transition period should extend beyond the natural expiration or scheduled termination date. A period of 9 to 18 months is fairly typical, depending on the complexity of the service mix. And as part of the transition assistance services, the incumbent provider should continue to provide the business as usual services under the current terms, as well as perform the additional transition-specific handoff tasks that'll be set out in the transition plan.
So Ben, how does this normally work in terms of charges for the transition assistance?
Yeah, good question, Joe. So the principle tends to be that if additional resources have to be deployed by the outgoing provider, so for example, they might want to deploy a project manager to work with a customer and the successor provider project managers, then there would typically be additional fees from the outgoing provider for those additional resources. But where the existing outsourced team are providing the work or performing the work to support that transition, it's not unreasonable to expect that work to be covered by the existing normal business as usual charges, since those existing charges are essentially covering the cost of those resources. But I will say that what charges should apply or should not apply for the transition assistance support can be a pretty challenging negotiation, including the degree to which the outgoing provider claims that the existing outsourced team needs to be supplemented with additional resources or perhaps paid overtime because there is more work to be done during transition over and above the normal work, if you will. Also, it's not uncommon for the outgoing provider to want some relief on service levels on the premise that their resources have to deprioritize their normal business as usual work to support transition activities instead. So often there is this tension in the negotiation between extra charges applying versus SLA relief.
Well, Ben, apart from the device access example that you noted, what other transition support is the outgoing supplier often asked to provide?
Yeah, so what comes up a lot is activity to support knowledge transfer from the incumbent to the successor provider. So large enterprises tend to have a lot of very custom, very unique processes and procedures that the successor provider needs to be educated on. And most of that knowledge resides with the outgoing provider. So it's very common for the outgoing provider resources to be asked to participate in various knowledge transfer activities. And then over and above knowledge transfer activities, such as just collating and handing over documentation, perhaps transitioning tools to the successor provider, supporting transition planning, inventory and physical handover any customer equipment the outgoing provider might have in its possession, any support necessary during the actual cutover of services to the successor provider, and then sometimes post-cutover stabilization support for issues that may come up.
Hey, Mark. Ben highlighted a range of topics and responsibilities that need to be proactively addressed with the outgoing provider. Since you're the lawyer amongst us, why don't you talk a little bit about best practice for capturing the transition assistance support in a contract with an outgoing provider?
Yeah, sure, Joe. So as I mentioned earlier, the base agreement that you negotiate at the commencement of the deal has certain transition assistance terms, but nailing down all the specific handoff responsibilities isn't feasible to do up front. These details oftentimes need to be reflected in a transition assistance agreement, or we call it a TAA. The TAA is usually prepared at the early stages of the transition period. The earlier the better. As soon as the decision is made to move away from your incumbent, it's best to start that work. And in the TAA, there are several important items you need to cover. The transition plan with key milestones, which will be dependent on where you're transitioning to. Ben mentioned the charges, negotiating a ramp down of the BAU charges. Sometimes those business usual charges include a fixed set of charges, so there's no easy way to use the existing contract to ramp those down, so you need to negotiate a ramp down of those charges. There's an SOW for the incremental resources been alluded to. If there's some additional resources beyond the deployment base from the incumbent, you'll need to determine what is the scope of work associated with their subject matter experts and any other activities that are incremental to the handoff. There is more times than not an asset transfer that happens in these arrangements where some of the assets may have been rented or tools that were used. The client wants to acquire them at the end of the deal. So scheduling those assets and a transfer of those assets becomes important in the TAA. And although we prefer to have an MSA that has comprehensive transition assistance services, and we don't typically in our clauses require TAAs to be executed in order for the client to enjoy the benefits of transition assistance services. And that's a key item, not to have a dependency on the TAA. But we have found that preparing a TAA is incrementally important to lead to success in an exit or transition.
Okay, Ben, you mentioned that the charges, or not, for transition assistance are a thorny negotiation topic. Now, in my experience, that's just one of the many potentially hard discussions with the provider. What other topics tend to be the tougher ones to negotiate?
Good question. Yeah, what tends to be the tougher items to negotiate? I think after cost, Joe, I think the thorniest topic is transition timeline. A key objective for the outgoing provider tends to be to lock down the timeline for the transition as tightly as possible as part of that transition plan that Mark mentioned. So this helps the outgoing provider minimize the costs on its side because it's far easier for them to ramp down their resources if the timeline for cutting over services is locked down and known far in advance. But the customer and the successor provider typically want more flexibility on the timeline. They may have a high level target overall timeline. That's normally known up front, but the specific timing, so when individual sites or equipment or users, the timing for when they may be cut over, that's typically worked out later. And of course, it's not completely out of the ordinary for things to go a little wrong or to get delayed. So the degree to which the timeline is known up front and locked down versus the degree to which the customer can adjust those timelines at its sole discretion, that's a really big part of the negotiation on these kind of things.
Okay, Mark, over and above some form of transition agreement, what other items likely need to be considered with the outgoing provider?
Triggering transition assistance may require some procedural hurdles that vary based on the reason the services are winding down. The transition period should generally be automatic when the term expires. You need not do anything in the natural expiration of your underlying MSA. And it should, by default, the transition period should extend for the full duration of your transition period. But we also like to include flexibility for the client to shorten that transition period as the transition plan and TAA become shaped out. You'll also want to make sure that the BAU service discontinuance or resource utilization reduction notice periods are trumped by the transition schedule in your TAA. or shortened. You don't want to have these long tail discontinuance provisions get in the way of you ramping down your services in a coordinated fashion to hand them off to the successor. When services are terminated prior to expiration, that automatic transition period becomes more cumbersome because you may have some underlying retained services, and you'll just have to be a bit more mindful of when you actually trigger a transition period. So a notice requirement for triggering transition assistance when there's a partial termination of a service tower or service function, that's typical. Our only guidance there is to keep those notice periods as short as possible. 30 days is fairly typical. Some providers oftentimes look for at least 90 days so they can start their resource planning. So somewhere between the 30 and 90-day range is where you tend to land. The successor will want to recruit certain of the outgoing provider's personnel, and customers often believe that retaining certain key outgoing providers' people on their account is desirable. But the incumbent will strongly resist that, and at the very least, they'll be unwilling to facilitate these transfers, partly because it disrupts the service provision, and partly because they just don't want to lose the good people. If the base agreement includes a non-solicitation clause, its restrictions should be expressly waived during the transition period to give the customer flexibility to negotiate a transfer of personnel that is effective for both the customer and the incoming provider. In Europe, there are some further complexities related to the legally required rebadging of outgoing provider personnel, and these laws are typically referred to as 2P ARD. That's subject of a different conversation.
All right, good stuff. Thank you, Mark, and thank you as well, Ben. Now, as promised, this has been a very insightful discussion. And if you'd like to learn more about the topic, or if you have other ICT needs that you'd like to discuss with Mark, Ben, me, or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2, please give us a call or shoot us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, checking out our websites, or by following us on LinkedIn.